This is Bill Blakemore here. I'm calling in from the UK on a glorious Tuesday morning. I think so far we have only a small number of delegates on this webinar. If you can hear me, I would be most grateful for you saying hello in the chat box, which should be perhaps to the right of your screen. So do chat and say hello to me if you can actually hear what I'm saying. I'm going to type in a hello message to you so that if you can't hear me, at least I know about it. Good morning and hello, Abdullah, Abdul Hadi. Good morning, Abdul Hadi. Welcome to the webinar. I think we're hoping for quite a few more people on this call. So I think for the moment, we won't start with the meat of the webinar. We'll wait for a little while for one or two more people to come on to the call. Abdul Hadi, while we're waiting for others, would you like to tell me a bit about yourself? Would you like to put a few notes in the chat box about who you work for and what you do? Hello, Marilis. Welcome to the webinar. Good to see you. You can hear me, can you? The great thing about these webinars is that there's always an expectation that they need to start on time. But of course, life doesn't necessarily facilitate that if you are a participant, because there may be other things going on in your world which stop you getting to the webinar. Thanks, Marilis. That's great to know that you can hear me. And I assume you can also see me on the webcam. Oh, that's great, Abdul Hadi. So you're with NNPC then, are you, up in Abuja? Oh, in Kaduna. Okay. I have been to your country a few times, not very recently, but I have been to Nigeria. But I never made it as far as Kaduna. So I got as far as Abuja and, of course, a few times in Lagos. Anyway, things very different from Lagos or Abuja or Kaduna, or indeed from our Glomacs colleagues who are on this call, who I guess are mostly in Dubai today. Thank you, Marilis, for letting me know that you can see me. It's always good to know the technology is working before we get into the meat of the session. So I can see we've also got Katharina on the call. Katharina, would you like to introduce yourself in the chat box? Type in a little bit about who you are and where you're from. That would be very helpful. The chat box is on the right of the screen, probably. Okay, we don't have anything from Katharina at the moment. Perhaps she's feeling a bit shy, but that's fine. Feel free to add your thoughts and comments into that chat box on the right-hand side. Once we get going with the webinar, which will be very shortly, one of the challenges I face is I'm concentrating on basically giving a presentation, and what's going on in the chat box isn't necessarily to the forefront of my observation. It's quite an intense experience actually giving one of these webinars. So I'm thinking about what I'm going to be saying. I'm thinking about the slides I'm showing you, but reading the chat at the same time is also a bit difficult. But we will have some pauses during the course of the webinar when I will have a look at anything you've put in there and find an appropriate moment to respond to it. There will also be a Q&A session at the end. The plan is for this webinar, once it starts, to be about 1 hour. So I hope that fits with your schedule. So if I haven't picked up your question, if you were asking a question during the course of the webinar, I'll try and do so at the end of the session. And welcome, Sesan Adeleye. Sesan, I guess, are you from Nigeria as well? You're welcome wherever you're from, but do tell us a bit about yourself. That would be really great. Type it into the chat box. That's fantastic. That's great. You're from Nigeria too. That's really good. Okay, folks. Well, look, it is 6 minutes past the hour. Here in Britain, it's actually, I think, the same time as in Nigeria. It's 6 minutes past 11. Some 6 minutes past 2 in Dubai. I think that's probably 6 minutes past 1 in Saudi Arabia. One has to get used to the different time zones on a call like this. Everybody's living through their own particular time. Anyway, it's mid-morning here in Britain, and I'll get going with the materials. Now, what you should see in front of you on your screen, assuming you've got a screen there, you've got the little webcam of me, so you can see what I look like sitting in my study here in Reading in the UK. That's about 60 kilometers west of London. And you should also see some slides that are on the screen with the title slide, the opening slide, Managing Contracts Virtually After the Pandemic. There is a PDF of this material, and I'm certainly happy that be shared by Glomacs with anybody who's attending this particular session. As well as the materials themselves, there is an extra handout which is available to you. We'll come to that in due course, and there'll be some moments for interaction. This particular tool, the Click Meeting tool we're using today, does permit some limited interaction. Obviously, the chat box is one of those things, but there's other ways as well. So anyway, let's crack on. Keen to make some good time. So first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm a business consultant, and I've been working with Glomacs now since 2012, so coming up for 8 years with them. Most of my working career, I worked for the major telecommunications company in the UK, BT, British Telecom, formerly state-owned. So if you're working for a state-owned enterprise like NNPC or one of its subsidiaries, then I know what it's a bit like to work for a government-type entity. I'm a lawyer by training and briefly in practice. I was in private practice in London as a barrister. That's a kind of advocate. Before I joined the world of employment and industry and ended up, as it says, working for BT for a very long time. So that's a bit about me. There don't seem to be any Arabic speakers on this call, but Arabic is one of those languages that I aim to make a little bit of progress with whenever I meet Arabs. I haven't found when I'm dealing with Nigerians that's necessary. And nobody seems to require me to speak Hausa or Igbo or Yoruba. So anyway, welcome to the call. And excuse me for my cough. I don't think it's COVID. I think it's just a slight tickle. So what are we going to be doing today? Well, first of all, I thought we'd start off by having a bit of a look at the COVID situation right now. I mean, we've all got a slightly different experience of this curious time. So let's have a look at what's actually going on in the world. And I've got various statistics to show you as to how different countries are performing and what that actually looks like. Then we'll go on to have a bit of a think about the impact of COVID, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the consequences of the pandemic, because there have been some pretty dramatic consequences, many of them caused by government intervention to try and get us out of this situation. So those lead on to some forecasts for what the economy is going to look like in the future, and in particular the petroleum sector. So those of you working in petroleum, you may already be appreciating that this time has not been good news for the oil industry. I'll then move on to the kind of key section of the session, which is looking at the world of contracting and contractors and contracts generally, essentially looking at the sort of claims that may be heading your way if you had contractors working for you, and at the same time, what your possible responses to those claims might be if you were thinking in purely contractual terms. So we'll look at it from a contractor and employer point of view before the concluding part of the session, which is a kind of action checklist, whereas you need to be taking some steps to manage the situation in terms of your contractors, and there may be some urgency about that, because it's certainly my belief, and there's plenty of evidence to support that they are having, some of them are having a very, very tough time. Okay, so that's the structure of the day. We will finish with a Q&A at the very end. So the webinar is being recorded, as you can probably, or you may have noticed, and I think Glomacs would tend to put these recordings up on their website after there's been some kind of processing going on. So expect that. A little health warning, not a COVID health warning, but a kind of legal health warning. We are talking about legal topics today, and I'm doing so from an English law point of view. Of course, different jurisdictions have their own laws, and I'm approaching, where we're talking about law, I will be approaching it from an English legal perspective. That's what I'm qualified to do. But in your own particular countries, for example, if you were coming from a civil law country, such as the GCC countries, then some of the laws might be different. Those of you coming from Nigeria, of course, as a former colony of the UK, your legal system is very similar to that in England and Wales. So some of the legal principles will be very, very similar there. But of course, you have your own laws. You've had more, since 1960, you have been creating your own laws. So there's not an exact similarity, but it will be a lot closer. So basically, in thinking about the law today, think about this as an information session. I'm not giving you legal advice. If you need legal advice, you must talk to your lawyers. Okay, so that's all by way of introduction. And I'm going to get the first little bit of interaction coming from you. There is the opportunity for me to run some surveys here, and I'm going to run the first survey, basically getting you to think about your experience of the pandemic and its after effects, and how has it been for you? So let's get that first survey up. And this survey, which should be on your screen right now, asks you to select one of these options. You can see there are 4 options. From this time has been great, I've enjoyed the period of time. There have been people who have felt like that, down to the very bottom, this has been terrible, I've suffered personally during this time. So please can you vote now and give me your perspectives so that we can get a sense of what it's been like for you during this curious time. Okay, I can see some votes coming through. That's great. Keep voting. Thank you very much. We've had, I think, 3 people vote so far, 4 people vote so far. Okay, keep it coming, folks. everybody's got their own personal perspective on this extraordinary time. So I really am very interested to know what how it has been for you. So of the what have we got here? We've got 4, 5, got six votes so far, 6 out of 9. I'll keep it running for another 15 seconds and then I'll end the voting. That's it. Keep your vote coming in. Find a way of pressing that button to vote. Okay. 7 out of 9. You've got, I'm going to count down now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stop voting. Okay. So thank you for that. I'll just share the results of that with you. Okay, we got 8. So we got 8 votes through, 8 out of 9. Sorry, number 9, that you didn't quite hit the button in time. So there we can see most people say the time has been okay, but it's been restrictive on your life. But one of our attendees has suffered personally. I'm sorry for that on your behalf, for your suffering or your loss. But the majority have found this, I would say, acceptable and okay period, with one of our candidates, of course, I don't know who's voted for what, saying, one of our delegates saying the time has been great. I think, I don't get the chance to vote in any of these surveys, but I would say I too would be voting with the majority here if I'd had the chance to vote. I have found some aspects of this time good, but to be honest, the restrictions on my life are difficult, and I don't necessarily sleep very well as a consequence of the turmoil that's going on in the world. So there we are. It's good to know how you feel before we carry on. So back to the slides, and let's have a think about what the world is facing right now. Obviously, the pandemic is ghastly for some people, and the world is really facing this kind of double whammy, isn't it? The fact that it's got a terrible disease, an unprecedented plague hitting the world, moving around the world. It's not doing so in a kind of even way, but the pandemic clearly for some people, is fatal. Not most people, but the suffering, people who get this, it can be very minor, it can be very, very serious or indeed fatal. And the response of governments to this has been to take various interventionist steps. And the consequence of those, as you can see from that chart on the right there, is that we're facing a recession this year, an economic recession. Just looking at the different countries we've got here, we've got our two sets of countries in two rows. So the UK is the UK here on the bottom row, facing a recession of maybe 6 or 7% this year, and Italy having an even tougher time, nearly 9%, I suppose. So the prospect of a recession and all of that means the unemployment, the shutting of businesses, and the increase in poverty in many places, is going to be very difficult. So if that's what we're facing, what have we been getting out of this right now? Well, of course, we've learned some new behaviors, haven't we, as a consequence of the pandemic? Some new risk management behaviors. A lot of what we're now doing is basically some kind of response to the risks of catching the virus, whether that's staying at home or keeping social distancing. I mean, I'd never heard of that phrase, social distancing, until about 3 months ago. And this new phrase came along. We all had to learn what it meant. It's the 2 meter rule, isn't it? At least that's what it is in the UK. The endless washing of hands and the thorough washing of hands, wearing a face mask when you're out and about. The UK has been somewhat ambivalent about face masks. In some countries, it's absolutely mandatory. In the UK, we've taken a a rather half-hearted approach. So people say, well, perhaps you should do if you're in a confined space. Maybe they'll toughen things up now that we're moving out of the current lockdown situation. A number of staff have been laid off temporarily. So we've got these furloughs. I didn't know what a furlough was until that was something that some of the clients I work with started to experience. Aerosols. I thought an aerosol was something to used to, for hairspray or something like that. Aerosols. This guy here coughing is coughing out aerosols. Basically, the COVID germs could be in his breath as he breathes them, and they could go quite a long way. The R number, the concept of the reproductive nature of this COVID virus, and whether the R is 1 or above 1 or less than 1. I think here in the UK, we've learned to know that if it's less than 1, the number of infections is reducing. If it's more than 1, it means that every single person who's got the infection is infecting more than 1 extra person. So we watch the R number as it's told to us by the government. And of course, testing and tracing, something that has been quite controversial here in the UK, because actually we haven't been doing much testing and tracing. We were doing some at the beginning, and then we stopped doing the testing and tracing, and then we built up testing over a period of time. Tracing basically started this week, and we're 3 months into the pandemic. So quite a lot of new language, new behaviors. Let's look at some statistics. Well, as of this weekend just gone, about the 1st of June, there are more than 6 million cases globally of people who have caught the virus, and about half of that number have it right now. So some people, of course, are moving out of having it now because they've got better. Others, sadly, have passed away. But there are about 3 million cases right now, and there have been a lot of deaths, more than 386,000 deaths worldwide. And in the UK, it's about 40,000 deaths we've experienced. So it's been very serious indeed. We also know that right now there's no vaccine for COVID-19. We don't know whether there is immunity. If you get the disease, whether you will be immune from catching it again in the future. And there's no cure. So the treatments that we have are really able to treat some of the symptoms, perhaps to help people improve a little faster. But there's no cure as such. So, we are in a difficult situation. As I say, it is an unprecedented time. Now let's move on to this question of testing. All of the statistics I've given you there, and some more that are coming up shortly, are based upon the concept of the test for the virus. And we did see or hear from President Trump recently his thoughts about testing. I'm going to play a little video to you where he gives his thoughts about testing and the great work that America's done in terms of testing. So let's see if I can play this little YouTube video to you. Okay, here we go. You're going to need your sound on. I guess you have your sound on because you're listening to me. Here we go.
Rapidly, and don't forget, we have more cases than anybody in the world. We have more cases than anybody in the world. Because we do more testing. When you test, you have a case. When you test, you find something is wrong. When you test, you find something is wrong. If we didn't do any testing, we would have very few cases. We didn't do any testing, we would have very few cases. They don't want to write that. It's common sense. So we test much more, many times. South Korea, hear about? Many times. South Korea. Spoke with the president of South Korea. Spoke with many different presidents, prime ministers. Many different presidents, prime ministers. They can't believe what we've been able to do on testing. They can't believe what we've been able to do on testing.
So there we are. There's Mr. Trump talking about the great work that they've done in America on testing. I've got another little survey for you here. I want your thoughts about what he's saying there. Notice he said, if we didn't do any testing, we would have very few cases. So let's see, do you agree with what he had to say? Let's get the survey up. Okay, so this is a straight yes or no. Don't forget we have more cases than anybody in the world. He finishes up, if we didn't do any testing, we would have very few cases. Do you think that's correct? Okay, keep your votes coming in. Okay, half of you have voted so far. It's only yes or no. Keep them coming, folks. Your life does not depend upon the answer. Okay, 6 so far, 6 out of 10. I'm going to do a countdown to end the voting because we have to keep moving today. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. End of voting. Okay, I'm going to share the results with you. So six of you voted out of the 10. Thank you for that. And half of you think President Trump is correct, and half of you think he isn't. That's very interesting. Let's close that down and get back to the slides. I mean, my own personal take on this is the testing is obviously very, very useful, but the test doesn't actually determine whether or not somebody has the problem, has the virus. I mean, think of this in pregnancy terms. If a woman doesn't take a pregnancy test, it doesn't actually stop her being pregnant. She isn't pregnant because of the test. She's pregnant because she's pregnant. So the test to me is an indicator. It's not the cause of there being the cases. But there we are. That's Mr. Trump's perspective. And now there is no doubt that testing is important because actually it colors our whole perception of what's going on. So all of the statistics suffer from probably some lack of testing. And the better a country is able to get to grips with understanding its position, then the more precise the knowledge of the situation. Let's have a look at what's going on in different countries. So here you've got a slide in front of you showing how the pandemic is moving at different speeds across the world. And we've got here, for example, at the top of my chart here, India is finding very nearly 7,000 new cases a day. And at the beginning of May, it was only finding just under 2,000 new cases a day. Now, one could draw two conclusions from this. First of all, they may have got a lot better about testing, so they actually understand their position better. Or it may be that the pandemic is ripping through India and has more than trebled in numbers over the course of the month. The UK, for its part, over the weekend, our rolling average for new cases is a 7-day rolling average of cases. We were finding just under 2,500 new cases every day. But at the beginning of May, we were finding 4,800 cases, very nearly 5,000 cases every day. So we have halved the number of cases that we have. What does that mean? Well, I know that we have ramped up testing, but nevertheless, the number of new cases is going down. So that does suggest to me that although this number of 2,500 is still a very big number, we do appear to be getting on top of the pandemic. In the UAE, we have more new cases being found at the end of May compared with the beginning. It's about half as many again. And in Qatar, I don't think there's anybody on the call from Qatar, we have 1,775 new cases per day. That's almost three times the number they were finding at the beginning of May. So that's the number of new cases. So that shows you whether apparently shows you whether or not the cases are increasing or reducing. With that caveat, how good is the testing regime? Compare this with a slightly different way of looking at the problem. And by the way, I'm sorry, folks, I don't have any figures from Nigeria. I didn't know there'd be people from Nigeria on the call. Otherwise, I'd have produced a Nigerian figure as well. But you can look up your own statistics by going to the link that's shown at the bottom of the left-hand column here, the COVID control link there. If you make a pen, write down that link, you will find out for yourself. You're able to compare new cases in your country, whether you're from Nigeria, Ghana, or many other countries. So it's an excellent source of information, this particular website. So in the UK, we've got here now is a slightly different analysis. This is basically looking at numbers of cases per million of the population. Now, the UK has about 66 million people in it today. And so if we think about how many new cases per 1 million of the population, we're finding about 36.5 new cases per day at the moment. Now, compare that with Qatar, where if they had a population of 1 million, they have a much smaller population than that, they're finding 638 new cases per million. So that suggests to me that within that little country in the Gulf, they are finding many, many new cases for the size of the population they have. Saudi seems to be in a position which is a little bit worse than the UK, but still a relatively low number, 59 new cases per million. And India was at the top of my previous chart. India here finding only 5 new cases per million. So if you have a very big population, then although the numbers of cases found may be large, proportionate to the numbers of people who are not sick, you get a slightly different perspective. So different ways of looking at the figures. The more you look at these figures, the more challenging it is to actually understand what's going on. Okay, so moving on, let's think about the global economy. No question about it, the global economy is taking a massive hit from this pandemic. Let's give you a couple of examples. One of the major producers of vehicles in the UK is Jaguar Land Rover. Its factories were closed until very recently. And for the whole country, not just Jaguar Land Rover, but all other car manufacturers, they only built 197 cars in April in the UK. Typically, 100,000 new cars are built in a month in the United Kingdom. So essentially, our car industry was closed during April. It's now beginning to open up. If we think about the airline industry, of course, the number of planes flying around massively reduced during the peak of the pandemic. I live, as I said, west of London, about 30 miles up to Heathrow. Quite often I have airplanes flying over my house. I haven't heard any today. I think yesterday I heard one. So even though I'm close to the UK's major airport, there has been very little air traffic. To give you some idea of how aviation has fallen, there you can see on this chart a typical year. So the green line on this chart is the moving average of commercial flights daily. That's the green line is 2019. The blue line is 2020. So around the world, the number of commercial flights massively fell away, although it is now beginning to recover. You can see here the beginning of May, in May 2019, average daily flights globally, 191,000. 20th of May this year, there were 110,000. So aviation traffic is recovering, but it's by no means back to its normal situation. Let's move to the oil sector, the sector that some of you are in. You can see here different ways of thinking about the oil sector, whether you're in the upstream exploration production end, whether you're in the downstream end, the refineries business, if you are perhaps in the LNG sector, or if you're in the kind of midstream sector, the pipelines business. No question at all, there's been a lot of bad news in this area. at about the same time as the pandemic has been going on. Not necessarily caused by the pandemic, too, I should say. Think back 6 years to the 2014-2015 oil price slump. Basically, on this chart in front of you, you can see the Brent crude 6-year chart, the price of Brent crude, a major measure for the price of oil, going back 6 years to the June 2014 and coming up to the present day. So that left-hand section inside the red box, you can see oil went from $120 a barrel down to less than $30 a barrel over the space of about 12 months. And at that time, it was caused by a few different factors. One of them was a massive supply glut. We had a lot of new producers coming on board from America, a lot of those shale producers. We had a very strong dollar, which made oil expensive because oil is priced in dollars. And we had a reduction in demand from China, which at that time was coming off the peak of its growth in GDP. So oil really crashed. And if we move to the right-hand side of this chart, you can see we have had another big crash. Oil prices have crashed by 40% since December. They're currently about $38 a barrel. I think that was Sunday's price. Of course, oil is a volatile commodity and prices do change. But, the trade disputes that have gone on between America and China and also between Russia and Saudi Arabia and America have resulted in an excess of oil. And at the same time, because of the COVID, there's been a drop in demand. So if we look at a chart from the Energy Information Administration of the US, that's a major source of information about what's happening in the oil sector, you can see if we look at this chart, the brown line on the chart here is world consumption of oil. And you can see the massive drop in consumption in the first 2 quarters of 2020. And that drop in consumption is much greater than the drop in production. So what we've ended up with is an excess of oil sitting around in tanks. Tanks have become very expensive because actually they're full. And that's meant that the oil commodity itself has, sometimes it hasn't had any place to go. And they had the extraordinary situation for oil futures about a month ago where oil was being priced at less than zero. It's really hard to imagine that oil could be basically, you get paid not to deliver it. So a very dramatic effects in the oil sector. This is not going to be good news for the upstream business because that's always the one that gets hit first. People don't want to start exploring and producing. They've already got plenty of stocks sitting there in the inventory. So let's have a look at the world going forward from where we are right now. What do we see? I came across this rather interesting picture of King Salman of Saudi Arabia, the President Trump, and this is President Sisi of Egypt. They were doing some kind of a launch, but I thought this is a good image for the for looking ahead, looking at the future. And what some people are saying, and there's a particularly great film about it. I don't have the time to show it to you actually today because we are pressed for time. But if you have a look at this film from The Economist magazine, published in mid-May, and if you copy the link down there, the bit.ly link that's shown there, the 90% economy, essentially what The Economist is saying, based upon very good evidence and studying what's happening in China, is that the world will recover, but it will recover back to 90% of where it was before. So that 10% difference is going to be very painful. And the 10% difference is going to be being caused because of drops in people's ability to create, to produce. The challenges of working will mean that we are no longer as productive as we were. 90%. Have a look at the video. As I say, I don't have the chance to show it to you right now. Okay, I want to move ahead now, and I want you to think about the impact of COVID on your organization. So from where you sit, how is it feeling to you? Let's have a look at another little survey. So if I can find... Okay, so here we have another simple question. I'm asking you to consider the likely impact of COVID-19 and its after effects. And by that, I mean basically the government responses to COVID, the likely impact on my company or organization. So will it be significant long-term negative, or do you think it'll be short-term negative, perhaps no impact? Or will it be positive? I mean, there are some organizations, if you've heard about the company called Zoom, for example, that's in the world of video communications. It does products a little bit like the one we're using right now, the Click Meeting product. Zoom has massively increased its business as a result of people not being able to move face-to-face. And so many of the tech companies anticipate doing very well as a result of this. Some of the food retailers have done very well. People have been stocking up and buying for the store cupboard, but so those food companies have done well out of the pandemic so far. So how are we doing? We've got 4 out of 8 people voting so far. I'm seeing. So the rest of you keep voting if you can. Give me your thoughts. 6 so far out of the 9. Keep voting, folks. I'll do a countdown very shortly to get your take on it. Okay, I'll do a 5 down to 0, and then I will stop the voting. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm ending the voting. And I'll share the results with you. So hopefully you can see there that all of you who voted felt that the COVID and its after effects will have a negative impact on your organization. One of you feels it will be significant and a long-term negative impact. The rest of you felt it would be a shorter term and lesser impact. Okay, that's good. Thank you for your thoughts. Back to the presentation. So that's the implications for you as you see it. Well, what about your contractors? You know, they're the ones who are performing on your behalf. They've got contracts with you to supply goods and services. Maybe they're carrying out construction, or they're doing other things on your behalf. So what are the implications for them? Well, you know, contractors are having a tough time. There's no doubt about it. Let's have a look at this little list here, and I'll explore some of these in a bit more detail. You can see, you know, perhaps that some contractors will have some manpower issues, non-availability. In some cases, transport is disrupted, so they can't actually get to where they're supposed to be working. Or maybe the location itself, or where they're supposed to be doing the work, isn't available. Or perhaps there are challenges about the way the work should be done. Perhaps that's now not possible, or perhaps much more expensive. Maybe there are some supply chain problems. They can't get the materials or that they need in order to perform the services. In some cases, some contractors will have financial difficulties, liquidity problems. They'll be running out of cash. And maybe the work that is available isn't actually economically viable. And of course, they exist within the supply chain, so some of the contractors will have subcontractors who also face similar kinds of problems. Let's have a look at some particular examples of what these might be. You know, unfit workers, people who are suffering from the virus. Okay, that's often a relatively short-term effect, but those workers have to go home, generally speaking. They're not fit to work. Government usually requires them to stay at home until they're well. And perhaps there isn't testing to find out whether they are or not suffering from the virus. So they may have to go home because they've got some symptoms. And if there's no testing, then they're off work anyway, even though perhaps they would be safe to be at work. So we've got those kinds of challenges. We've got challenges around quarantines, different sorts of quarantines. Perhaps you are required to stay at home if you've got the virus for up to 14 days. Or maybe you're traveling to a job, you're traveling across an international border, and you can't get into the country, or if you can't get into the country, you have to go into quarantine. And then when you return from that country, you have to go into quarantine again. Now, as of Friday next week, Friday of this week, Britain is introducing a quarantine system for international travel. So people arriving in the UK, unless they are in one of the exempted categories, will have to start a 14-day quarantine period. And they may have already experienced a 14-day quarantine period in a remote country as well, such as Australia or New Zealand, or perhaps in the Middle East. So quarantine could be a very big problem for contractors with their staff. Some types of job are not permitted. Now, whether that's flying, there have been travel bans, or whether it's personal services like having your hair cut. I haven't had my hair cut by a barber for more than 3 months. Happily, my wife is pretty nifty with the scissors, but otherwise, I'd have hair down to my shoulders. So, services may not be legal. Or perhaps the locations are closed. If you are offering swimming pool services, public swimming pools are closed right now in the UK. They're required to be closed by law. Likewise, many hotels, restaurants, bars, most shops currently not allowed to be open. Or perhaps one of the challenges that some kinds of suppliers and contractors will face will be around the way the contract is due to be performed. Now, in some cases, they're very strict. Take a charter party agreement. That's a transport agreement to move freight from one location to another, usually internationally. And the charter party documents will say the two ports, the port of loading and the port of unloading. It'll name the vessel, and there will be some other strict requirements. Now, sometimes ports are closed currently, or the crew of the vessel is put in quarantine. So the contract becomes impossible to perform because of challenges like this, the way it was supposed to be being performed. Supply chain, a big issue. We've had massive problems around face masks, ventilators, and other medical gear. Now, if your contractor was obliged under a contract to supply to you, they may not have been able to do so because of supply chain problems. A lot of this stuff is made in China, and China had its own difficulties when it came to manufacturing, and some of the product that was being manufactured was of poor quality as well under the specification. So the contractor ends up not being able to meet his contractual obligations. And all of this can lead to cash flow problems. Contractors suffering from lack of resources, really, lack of funds. He can't pay his people. He can't buy the materials for projects. He's still required to pay his rent or have other demands, meet his interest payments, for example. And maybe the things that he's required to buy have suddenly become a lot more expensive. So, contractors will be suffering financially. And when faced with certain kinds of work, as I said, some of that work may be uneconomic. Look at this picture of a theatre in Berlin. On the left-hand side, you've got the theatre full of people celebrating at a concert that they attended. And then look at the picture on the right. That's what that theatre looks like right now. The theatre seating has had to be rearranged to keep social distancing for audiences. They've taken out every other row, and they've taken out chairs between chairs. So here you can see we've got individual chairs removed, but then there was another row of chairs that's missing. What this means for the theatre, of course, is a big drop in income. They're not going to be able to increase the prices of the tickets in order to make up the difference in the lost income because their capacity has been cut. Perhaps this theatre will no longer be viable. So let's think about the impact of COVID-19 on my suppliers and contractors. Another little survey for you. Let's close the last one down and have a look at our impact on contractors. Okay, so what do we think? Previously you were voting on the impact on your own organization. Now I want you to think about the impact of COVID on your suppliers and contractors. Similar kind of answers here. I'm asking you to vote for, going from substantial long-term down to short-term, no impact, or a positive impact. So please vote. Let's keep it swiftly moving. That's it. Keep the votes coming in. Keep voting, people. It's great to get your inputs here. Right. Okay, I'm going to be doing a countdown very shortly. Half of you have voted so far, so the remainder, please vote now, or however, hold your peace, as they say. Counting down from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. End of voting. And I'll share the results with you. So you can see that a rather greater number of you this time felt that there would be substantial long-term negative impacts. All of you who voted said it would have negative impacts. So in some cases short-term, in some cases longer term. But nobody thought it was no impact. Nobody thought it was a positive impact. Okay, so back to my charts. Let's take a step back from thinking about impact and think about contracts themselves. What are they there for? What are they designed to do? Contracts are agreements, aren't they? Contracts are legal agreements. They're entered into freely by the parties, and the idea is they set out the rights and obligations available to the parties. The general principle is that agreements should be met. Pacta sunt servanda, that old Latin phrase. Agreements should be served. Agreements should be carried out, whatever those agreements are. And sometimes the agreements are priced on a fixed price lump sum basis. And if you don't do what you're supposed to do under the agreement, basically that's a default. That's a breach of contract leading to some kind of a claim. So if you've got that as your situation and you are an employer, the contract owner, so you're the one you've done the procurement, you've got a contractor working for you, you probably want your contract performed. But some of these contractors will face some enormous difficulties now, as you recognized when you did the voting just then, actually doing their performance. They may claim force majeure. They may claim that the contract has been frustrated, that it's impossible, or they may claim that changes in the law have made it more expensive. There are some other kinds of things they could claim as well. Let's have a look at some of those in detail. What is force majeure? Basically, it's in a common law country like Britain, the UK, or in West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, in the United States, other places that have a common law system. Force majeure is a contractual remedy. You need to put it into the contract for it to exist. If you don't put in a force majeure clause, the law does not write one in for you. Okay, so it's a contract-based remedy, and it offers protection to suppliers, contractors, other parties to contracts who can't do the things they were obliged to do under the contract or cannot do for a period of time. They're hindered from performing. Maybe it's not impossible, but they're hindered from performing. So this protection means that the party that was seeking the performance, that isn't getting the performance, is not able to make a claim for a breach of contract, because the party that can't perform is protected by the force majeure. The force majeure clauses are contract specific. Okay, they're not all the same, the clauses, and you need to read them very carefully. One of the essential things about a force majeure clause is it defines what kind of events are going to be the triggers for giving the protection. Okay, and there must be a cause for that protection to be sought. There must be a direct link between the event, the trigger event, and the non-performance. So if it's unrelated, it's been a bad thing, but it's not related to the non-performance, then that protection will not be available. Let's have a look at a particular contract. This is the taken from the Red Book construction contract, the Red Book being a contract, a model contract put out by FIDIC, the Federation of International Consultant Engineers. It defines force majeure for contracts that are under these terms and conditions. This is from the 1999 FIDIC Red Book model terms, and you can see it gives from letters A to D here some preconditions. You know, the event must be beyond the party's control. It was such that it could not have been reasonably provided against before starting the contract, and it couldn't have been avoided or overcome, and it's not attributable to the party. So essentially, it's not the fault of the party making the claim. And so you've got these preconditions, and then you've got some types of events, and you can see here the general definition is force majeure may include, but is not limited to, exceptional events or circumstances of the kind listed below, so as long as the conditions A to D, the ones we looked at before, are satisfied. So not limited to these. So these are examples, in a sense, of what could be. So things like war, terrorism, riot, explosions, natural catastrophes such as earthquakes, hurricanes, and typhoons. The contract doesn't actually mention pandemics, interestingly. So that's that thing. Some contracts also refer to government action. So a government blockade, for example, a government lockdown. And in some force majeure clauses, the list is an exhaustive list. That is to say, if the event is not listed, then it cannot be force majeure. In other cases, just as we've seen there, the list is one of examples. There could be other things happen which are also force majeure. You've got some examples of what they are. So read the clause to see whether it can apply. Some modern contracts do also include pandemics. This one is one that is taken from the International Chamber of Commerce model contract and lists a set of what it calls impediments to performance, including act of God, plague, or epidemic. So that's nice and explicit, isn't it, if you were faced with that. Other points about force majeure, generally speaking, the party affected by the event must communicate, and he must do so in line with the communication requirements in the contract. Perhaps he has to give notice as soon as pretty much as soon as the event has happened, or maybe within 24 hours. And he needs to also perhaps spell out in his communication what he's trying to do to limit the impact. So occasionally, you have to keep communicating. So communication is a very important part of a claim for force majeure. If your contractor is claiming force majeure, then consider what was the notification procedure? Did he follow it? Okay, so the common effects of a successful claim for force majeure would be that the party claiming it, his obligations are temporarily suspended. It's usually temporary. Occasionally, one side or the other, usually the client, who's not getting the services because of the event that the contractor is stopping the contractor working, sometimes there is a termination option. And sometimes, very occasionally, the contract may be discharged completely by the force majeure event. That's quite rare. So that's the common effects of a successful claim. The results of an unsuccessful claim, if the contractor doesn't meet those requirements, perhaps the event isn't of a type or there's no causation, then the contractor's non-performance will be a breach of contract, leading to potentially claims for damages, compensation, termination, penalties in jurisdictions where penalties are permitted. They're not permitted in most common law countries, but they are permitted in the GCC. Okay, so this degree of causation, it's got to be a direct causal link, and if you had multiple causes of the non-performance, that's usually going to cancel out the claim for force majeure. I'm going to run ahead now and look at what happens if there isn't a force majeure clause in the contract. Well, there may be the possibility of claiming that the contract's been frustrated. So the contract performance has been made impossible, or, as it says here, transformed into something radically different from what the parties contemplated. So it's a different kind of performance because of what's taken place. Frustration is a very difficult claim to bring. Most claims for frustration are not successful. The successful result of a claim for frustration is that it brings the contract to an end. So it's not a question of the contractor being given more time, for example. It brings the contract to an end. So we're thinking about impossibility as my screen capture from Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. Maybe you saw the Tom Cruise film. So impossibility. Some examples of frustration. Perhaps here's one: the timber merchant agreeing to buy wood and lease a timber yard, and then the government's intervention in the wartime made sales of wood illegal. So this legislation frustrated the contract. That was a successful contract claim. Another case where a theatre burned down after the hire contract had been made, but before the performance. So the contract was frustrated by the burning of the theatre. So in neither of these cases would there have been a force majeure clause. Essentially, you're looking at the common law remedy of frustration. Okay, so it's a difficult thing to claim for successfully. We had a recent claim for frustration by one of the European institutional bodies, the European Medicines Agency, was operating in London in the Docklands, and then Brexit came along. Brexit, of course, meant that the UK left the EU, and the European Medicines Agency needed to be within an EU member state. So it could see this was what was happening, and it sought a claim to say that the lease of its Canary Wharf headquarters had been frustrated. The court rejected that claim. It said, no, you can do other things with this lease, and which indeed is what they did. They sublet it to another party. Okay, so another contractor defense to non-performance might be that the law has changed, making it much more expensive or much more time-consuming to do the work. So they would be looking for some compensation from you if they are indeed to perform. So things like government lockdowns, closures, stay-at-home orders, travel bans, or extra costs. Think of all the new PPE that contractors are going to have to buy in order to keep the social distancing in place, the new face masks, the new other kinds of PPE. Now, there are contract clauses which allow these sorts of defenses. Here's another one from the Red Book. So adjustments for changes in legislation. This is clause 13.7 of the 1999 model contract. The contract price shall be adjusted to take account of any increase or decrease in the cost resulting from a change in the laws of the country, which affect the contractor in the performance of its obligations under the contract. So if the contractor suffers or will suffer delays or incurs or will incur additional cost as a result of these changes, he can basically put in a claim to the engineer. He's the kind of administrator of the contract, and he shall be entitled to an extension of time and payment of such cost, which ends up being lumped into the contract price. So some contracts include these adjustments for changes in law, allowing contractors to make successful claims. Okay, so thinking about anticipating the claims, I won't do the survey this time. I'll move on from that. But you may expect claims of the kind we have just been looking at. How are you going to respond to those claims? It's a big question for you, and I think you have some options. Lots and lots of clauses in contracts give contract owners rights. When you get hold of the detailed slides, you'll see that these contract clauses are typical kinds of remedies that contract owners have. For example, in some contracts, the contract owner has the termination for convenience clause. Let's look at what that means. Here's one from a contract which SABIC uses, SABIC being the Saudi Arabian Basic Industries. It's a petrochemical company, very large petrochemical company. The purchaser, in this case SABIC, may terminate any purchase agreement for its convenience at any time and for any reason by giving notice. So that's a very powerful thing that they can do. If they do give notice, then they have to make some compensation payments to do with the costs that have been incurred, but they have the right to end the contract. Let's go back to what the impact is of the change, perhaps on the price, and comes back with some information about that, which the purchaser, SABIC in this case, thinks about, consults, and notifies the supplier whether or not the change is going to go ahead. So you might do that. You might say, I don't want you to do the work that you are proposing to do. We want to change the requirement. Or perhaps the contract owner looks for liquidated damages for delay. So takes a very tough line, says, look, I'm not going to tolerate late performance. I need you to perform in a timely way. And a range of other things here, right up to including disputes. So contract owners do have the opportunity to do a number of different things when it comes to claims from suppliers. And of course, there is another approach you could take, which is to try and find a way out of the solution, out of the problem, to negotiate a solution. So that is perfectly acceptable. Bear in mind that there may be some pressure from governments in order to behave in a particular way. And I was amazed to see this coming in. Normally, governments steer clear of interfering in contracts. But what we have got in the UK right now is some so-called guidance. It's not legally binding, but it's guidance from governments trying to control the responses by contract owners to non-performance issues by contractors. So this guidance, and this is the extra download for the materials for this webinar, which you might be interested in having a look at. Maybe your government has done something similar. So in the UK's case, this came out on the 7th of May. It's looking to try and ensure responsible and fair contractual behaviour by contract owners. It says this kind of behaviour is strongly encouraged in performing and enforcing contracts where there's been a material impact from COVID. Okay, this includes being reasonable and proportionate in responding to performance issues and in enforcing contracts. Acting in a spirit of cooperation, aiming to achieve practical, just, and equitable contractual outcomes, having regard to the impact on the other party, and also having regard to the availability of financial resources, protection of public health, and the national interest. This is a pretty amazing piece of government documentation because it's trying to encourage contract owners not to use the remedies available to them in their contracts, the kind of remedies we were talking about: liquidated damages, termination, claiming compensation, penalties, all of that kind of stuff. It's really trying to say, please don't do that, in the circumstances. As I say, this is not binding, but you might have a case where if a law case came to court, how did the parties behave? Did the contract owner, for example, mitigate its losses, something it's required to do under normal contract provisions? Then if it didn't follow the government guidance, it might well find that it was not going to have a successful claim. So basically, the government's trying to push contractors and contract owners to negotiate and to try and work things out in a fair way. So I'm going to get you to do almost last survey. Let's have a look at what your likely approach is going to be when suppliers make claims for when they make claims about what you should be doing. If I can find this particular survey. Okay, so how will we respond to claims? That's we, the contract owners. Really, you've got a choice of 3 here. We will resist the claims strongly. We will require to be persuaded what's the contractual basis for the claim and what is the clear evidence of the claim. Or we will be sympathetic and work collaboratively to resolve the issues. So I'm interested in your thoughts here. What is your likely approach going to be in managing these contracts that are in difficulty? Okay, keep those votes coming in, folks. That's really great. Okay, I'll do the countdown here. We've had half of you have responded. Thank you for that. Do the countdown now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to end the voting and share the results so you can see that about half of you responded, and the majority, 3 out of the 5 who responded, thank you for that, will be sympathetic and will work collaboratively to resolve the issues arising. So that's interesting, isn't it? I must say, when I've talked to contract owners in the past, where contractors are not performing, quite often the response is a very tough one. It's to resist the claims, to try and reduce the claims as much as possible, and that's seen as part of the job. Perhaps what we've got here is some evidence of some tolerance, some toleration of the fact that contractors are going to be having a tough time in the current period and in the months in the months ahead. So thank you for that vote. Okay, folks, we are in the last stages of the webinar now. You'll be pleased to know we did start a bit late, so that's why we're finishing a little bit late. Just a few actions for you to consider going forward. I believe that many contractors will be having a tough time right now, but you do need to protect yourselves. And I think the first thing you should be doing is considering your current situation, particularly having a strategic review of the most important supplier relationships you have, the strategic suppliers. Do you know whether there's a crisis going on inside those organizations? Which particular suppliers should you be focusing on? What sort of challenges are those suppliers facing? You've got some examples there. We've already looked at the kind of things that could be happening. Those suppliers could be facing some big challenges. So do that review, and I think you should do that sooner rather than later. And you may detect from the supplier behavior as to them having those problems. So having done that review, the stage after that is to look at your own contracts. Make sure you understand what the supplier's obligations are, and of course, what your own obligations and risks might be. Are you able to perform what you're supposed to be doing? Quite often with contractors, you have to do some things first before they do their bit. So make sure you know your contract position properly. Step 3 is about validating the strategic review. That's by basically having a dialogue consisting of writing some questions down and sending them to the contractor, perhaps holding clarification interviews with those suppliers, maybe by this method here, Zoom or Google Meet, or one of the many video tools that we have available to us now, so that you can get their responses back in writing and also consider with them face to face over a screen, what situation are you in? Are we going to have some problems ahead? The next step is, I think you need to think about some priority actions after you've got the information back from your review and your checking with the review. So what are your priority actions? It could be that you need some contingency measures, some alternative suppliers. You may need to think about bringing some things in-house if external supply is going to be challenged. Perhaps you're going to be needing to do some training. You may need to make some advance payments to keep contractors afloat. So think about those things. The next part of your action checklist is make sure you know what you want. So this is something you need to do early, but it's not quite as immediate as the things I've just gone through. So what are you actually after? Do you want to get these contracts back on track? Probably that is what you want to do. Or maybe you want to stop the project because your own situation has changed. Maybe you need a different contract now, or a different contractor. And this leads on to basically having a plan which you then implement, a plan with some new objectives, new strategies, maybe new performance measures. Perhaps you need some new procurements. You do need to communicate. Communication is the heart of all of this. So that would be your last step in your plan. Okay, so we're coming up to the final part of the slide. I'm going to do our last survey. This is time for your experiences on this webinar, your feedback. I'm most interested. There are 2 questions. First of all, how well did the webinar meet your expectations? You've got a choice of 3. And then, did you have any technical difficulties taking part in the webinar? I'm keen to find out whether or not you had some problems on the call today. Okay, keep those votes going. This is from a personal perspective, getting your feedback on the session, very, very important to me and also to Glomacs, of course. See, most of you don't seem to have had too many problems getting the webinar to work, although some of you have. Some of you have had problems keeping the connection up. And I guess, in my experience in West Africa, sometimes the internet isn't what one would like it to be. And as a consequence, you maybe lose the line. And if you're using a phone to access today, maybe the maybe the Wi-Fi went down or something else like that. So I would understand if you had some technical difficulties. Keep those votes coming in, folks. Always keen to get your response. Okay, I'm going to end the voting very shortly. Okay, counting down from 5. I see more of you have responded to the question about technical difficulties than have answered the question about meeting your expectations. That's interesting. I'm going to count down from 5 and end the voting. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. End of voting. Okay, so just to give you the answers there, you can see that of those of you that voted, everybody who voted said it met their expectations. That's always a delight to know. And most of you didn't experience too many problems getting through. That's also good to good to know. Okay, so last slide. Basically, are there any questions? If there are, please let me have them. I don't see any questions at the moment in the chat box, but if there are, please, please let me have them. I see Awanku Hashim has said, "Can I get the presentation materials? I missed the early parts due to connection issues." I'm very happy for you to have these materials, Awanku, and if you do not receive them proactively from Glomacs, then please contact them directly, and they have my permission to share them with you. So very happy for you to do that. There is going to be, at the end of the day, a post-webinar test for those of you who want to do that kind of thing. It's not live yet. Make a note of the link, but don't click it for a couple of hours. So click it this evening, and you will find a little test there which will assess what you've taken in from today's session. So it's not quite live yet, or at least it's not complete yet. So don't do it yet, but do make a note of that post-webinar test, looking at all of the content that we looked at today. Okay, I'm going to close down the presentation here, and I don't see any questions. So I think it's now would be a good time to end the session, as we are over time. So that's what I will do. Thank you for your attendance. Delightful to have you on the call. Good to hear from you. Thanks for participating.